Good afternoon and welcome to the Newsroom Pub. I'm Milwaukee Press Club President Maryann Lazarski from Milwaukee PBS, and I'm happy to be here today with Marquette Law School pollster Charles Franklin. Before we get started, I would like to thank our event sponsors. Our presenting sponsor is Spectrum News 1. Our supporting sponsor is We Energies. I would also like to thank our event partner, WizPolitics.com. WizPolitics.com partners with the Press Club for this luncheon as part of its ongoing event series in Milwaukee, sponsored by UW-Milwaukee, Wisconsin Academy of Global Education and Training, 1125 at Pabst, Milwaukee Police Association, The Firm Consulting, Medical College of Wisconsin, and Spectrum. I would like to welcome our panel of journalists here. Craig Gilbert, Fellow, Marquette Law School Lubar Center for Public Policy Research. Deanna Gutierrez, anchor and reporter, WISN 12 News. And Corey Hess, reporter for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Now back to Charles Franklin. Franklin is a nationally recognized government scholar and pollster and has been director of the Marquette Law School Poll since its inception in 2012 and became a full-time member of the faculty in 2013. He will make some opening remarks, and then our journalists will start with questions, and then we will take questions from the audience as well. So please welcome Charles Franklin.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Congratulations on everyone surviving another round of the elections. So I have just a few things that I want to mention, but mostly we're going to let the discussion be driven by the three of you. Just these things. I think one important point about polling and campaigns is that the polls, it's said every time, a poll is a snapshot in time, right? But with virtually every release, if the poll doesn't match where people believe the race will end up, the conclusion is that the poll is wrong in some way. And I think to believe that, you have to believe that campaigns don't matter at all. That it should just be completely static, and the results throughout the year should only mirror the way they will be at the end. And I think this reflects the kind of weird situation we are with polling, that 2016 and 2020 raised abundant and appropriate concerns about the accuracy of polling and whether there were problems with polling as a methodology. But simultaneously with now doubting every poll, and I can't tell you, I haven't kept count, but I doubt I've answered less than 100 interviews about what's wrong with polling over the last 6 years. It might be 200 interviews. Again, that's totally appropriate. That's not in itself the complaint. But at the one hand, there's this real doubt so that every poll, not just mine, has to be put in the context of can we believe this thing? And why maybe we shouldn't believe the thing. And if it doesn't line up with where you subjectively think the end result will be, then there's a doubt about this. And I just want to push back on that and say, if, as I believe, campaigns do happen, you should expect Mandela Barnes to be looking better after he's just swept to victory in a primary and 3 of his top 10 opponents have dropped out. You should expect, after a deluge of negative ads, that his support might fall off and Johnson's rise a little bit. I don't know what you would expect about the tightening of the race at the end. I'll leave that for maybe the discussion here. But I just want to say there's this issue, and it's as much on pollsters, maybe more so on us as anyone else. But it is this issue of dismissing actual survey evidence if it doesn't fit people's priors of where the end game is. And that actually strips us of the ability to appreciate the dynamics of the campaign a bit. So I don't have an answer to how you do that, but I think it's important to stress that because we certainly saw those dynamics play out. I want to say the second thing about this sense that polling is broken and it was terrible and we shouldn't believe it all is that it added a lot of credence to the polling late in the campaign that seemed to show a massive red wave building. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you that there was lots of reporting over the last 2 or 3 weeks about the red wave is back, it's going to be a crushing defeat for Democrats, up to the point that at least one polling aggregator started deliberately adjusting their polling averages, assuming that the errors this time would be as big in favor of Democrats as they were in 2020, especially 2020. The trouble with that, and at least one good analyst pointed this out, is that errors that an individual pollster makes from one year to the next election is virtually uncorrelated. So knowing that a poll was off in a Democratic direction in 2018 tells you next to nothing about whether it will be off in a Democratic or a Republican direction in 2022. But I think that sense that the polls were so badly wrong in 18, and they were pretty badly wrong and across the country, but to then assume from that when you saw polls showing tight races or modest Republican leads, that you should add 4 to 6 points in favor of the Republicans there. And I think that's where the doubt about the polls helped provide the foundation for exaggerating the Republican wave at the end, and indeed for dismissing some of the polls that were showing a very tight race or even a tightening race towards the end. So I think those are systematic features of the way we think about polling, the way we think about the dynamics of polls over the course of the campaign, that I and you should all be thoughtful about going forward to somehow balance not believing the polls are infallible, because God knows that's not true, but at the same time, not becoming so doubtful of them that we become suckers for information wars that try to give us a reason to believe those prejudices are true and there really is a big shift taking place. So I think those are lessons I would take away this time. For our campaign, again, I think the shifts we saw in our poll and some other polls done in the state matched up pretty well with at least my sense of the campaign dynamics of advertising issues and how that shifted over time. I think the big finding for us is that those shifts were largely driven by independents shifting their preferences. Partisans were very tightly aligned with party throughout, with a minor exception. But independents, including those who are independent but lean to one party or another, accounted for most of the shifting we saw from August till October. The one small exception is we did see a little variation in party loyalty that accounted for some, but only some of that shift. But independents still play a role. If you're talking about independents who are not closer to either party, that's under 10% of our electorate. It's a very small group, and a lot of those folks are disengaged from politics or actively angry about politics, often reluctant to choose a Democrat or a Republican and anxious to find some alternative. So that's a particularly difficult group because it's so small. But when you add in those that lean to one party or another, but who say they're independent to begin with, their party loyalty is typically varied between about 75% and about 85% with the party. So they clearly do lean to the party. But partisans are voting with their party between 95 and 98% of the time. So the point here is it's not like these leaners are just empty vessels to be filled, but they are people who can shift a bit. And look at the dynamics of our polling and about the campaign. We're going from a few points in the single digits one way to a few points in single digits the other way in our outcomes. And I think that's about the right magnitude to think this influence is. Just quickly mention that the Dobbs decision was a big one in boosting Democratic turnout, which had lagged Republican enthusiasm in the spring and in June prior to the Dobbs decision. So I think there's pretty good reason to believe that played a role. how big a role it played in the vote choice is important but modest. I just want to give you a couple of quick examples. If you look at Republicans who favored Dobbs, thus striking down Roe, 2% of them voted for Barnes. 9% of those who opposed striking down Roe voted for Barnes. So that's a 7-point difference in the vote choice among Republicans based on whether you favored or opposed striking down Dobbs. For people that think of issues as if they were single issues, if abortion was going to be the most important issue and therefore everybody who opposed Dobbs would vote Democratic. No, that's not the way this works. A 7-point difference in this vote margin is a pretty modest thing, but it's there. If you look at independent Republicans, people who lean Republican, then the gap is for those who favored overturning Dobbs, Roe. 3% voted for Barnes, but for those who opposed overturning it, 27%. Mandela Barnes is still losing independent Republicans by 3-1, but he's picking up quite a bit based on this issue. So the takeaway here is simply, there's a tendency to look at the issue, look at the balance of opinion on the issue, and say, well, there's the ballgame. Well, if that were true, since over 60% opposed overturning Dobbs, the Democrats should have won with 60% of the vote. That obviously didn't happen. But I'm not going to keep doing it, but if I went through all of the levels of partisanship, you would see similar sized movements in each group. So we're controlling for partisanship. An issue does make a difference. Dobbs did make a difference. But the difference it makes is between a few single-digit points and maybe a dozen or 24 points at most. Not that it completely converts every partisan who has a different position into a voter for the other party. And just lastly, the post-election analysis. The geography of the state continues to evolve. Some of you might remember back to the days when if you made a map of election results here, there was a really pretty clear eastern part of the state that was mostly red and western part of the state that was mostly blue, with the obvious exception of Milwaukee on that score. That old east-west divide is basically completely gone. What we have are pockets of Democratic strength that also happen to be in the big places, and then a wide spread of Republican strength throughout the rural parts and the north and west and so on. The caveat is that the cities and the large towns are all moving in a Democratic direction, and a number of them have passed over into Democratic majorities. And when you look at the shift at the county level, the Southeast, including the Republican counties in the Southeast, are continuing a movement in a Democratic direction. Still majority Republican, but not 70% Republican. I think Michels ended up with 59% in Waukesha County, for example. And that's not particular to this election. We saw that shift taking place from Walker in 2010 to Walker in 2014. We saw it in the presidential race, from Romney in 12 to Trump in 16, and Trump in 16 to Trump in 20, but we also saw it in the Supreme Court races in that period. We also see it with Senator Johnson this year versus 2016. So the point is, this is a long-term, multi-candidate, multi-office process that's taking place, and it is reshaping the state. Part of that is the density divide, that you just look, and if a county is very Democratic or fairly competitive or quite Republican, doesn't matter. If it's a big urban county, it's moved in a Democratic direction. If it's a smaller place, it's moved almost invariably in a Republican direction. So that urban-rural or density divide, whatever you want to call it, is very clearly at play in our politics right now, along with these regional differences. So I'll stop. Take it away.
Thank you, Charles. So my first question is a simple one. What's the one thing that surprised you most about what happened in the 2022 election? And you're not allowed to say nothing.
Well, it was that question, obviously, because I hadn't anticipated that question. I think I have to say that the shifts among independents and the shifts back among independents was a pretty interesting thing. We talk appropriately about how polarized the state is and about how polarized the voting is. And that was true in our data most of the year, that over 90% of each party was voting with that party's candidates, with a little bit of variation, but that partisan part is sort of cemented. But we did see the independents shift quite a bit. The Barnes case is probably the strongest. In August, independents were leaning 15 points for Barnes over Johnson. But then it got tied around, or basically tied in September. Then Johnson took an advantage. Then it tightened up a little bit at the end. I think that is the example of where, I hesitate to call them swing voters are, but it is where we see shifts in preferences. A close second would be the split decision between the governor and the Senate. For folks that eat, live, and breathe partisan politics, heads explode in both parties that both of these people could win on the same ballot. And that's because the partisans are so wrapped up in what they believe that they can't imagine anybody that would vote for Tony Evers could possibly also vote for Ron Johnson, and vice versa. And I think that's, again, comes back to the independents, who are not as partisan, they're not as ideological, they're not consumed by politics to the same extent that strong partisans are. And so for them, the personalities of the candidates matter. For them, individual issues that come along, or maybe the ads, or maybe personal influence matter. One finding we got from the results this time is the impact of favorability to the two incumbents was more than double the impact of favorability to either of the challengers. And I think that's a fairly common situation. Who do you know best? Of course it's the incumbent you know best. And so feelings towards them play a bigger role in structuring the votes, especially of those independents who aren't super partisan. And that's where I might like Ron Johnson and I kind of like Tony Evers, and then I vote for both of them. And that's not a contradiction outside of the most partisan folks, partisan and ideological folks.
My question relates to the polls when it comes down to the makeup of the voters, right? So we know that the latest Marquette Law School poll was on November 1st. 802 registered voters. Out of those, 679 are likely voters. Now we see the split, right? We see Democrat, Republican, Independent. Is there a way to know how diverse that group is without the political party affiliation? Can you make sure that that group is diverse enough?
Diverse in the partisan sense?
Right, in terms of race or in terms of male-female?
We put out with every release the full set of demographics of the survey, so you can see what percentage are Black, Hispanic, other race, male and female, education levels, and all of that. We also, in that same release and in the methodology statement, show you the makeup of the raw sample before we wait to education, for example, and how that compares with the latest census data for that demographic group. And so, two things. One is the raw data will always show the common biases that show up in responses to every survey that anybody in the universe has ever done. And that is that more educated people are more willing to respond, and older people are more willing to respond. So we always have, in the raw sample, fewer people under 35 and more people over 50 than the census data show. Same thing for education. We'll have fewer people with a high school-only diploma, more people with a college degree or a postgraduate degree. But what all pollsters do is then weight the sample so that we match those known demographics in the population. Because we do trust the census. I will not broach any argument on that. And so we wait for that, so that, again, this is in the methodology release that's posted on the website with every single poll. You'll see that the weighted sample is virtually identical to those census statistics. Now, there's a second step, and that's the filter for likely voters, because that's not based on my saying whether this person is likely to vote. It's that person telling me they're absolutely certain they're going to vote. And so those demographics are not then re-weighted to a census data set, because you want the dynamics. You want people to change their mind about voting and for that to shift the composition of the electorate. And so that's why we do it that way rather than assigning some a priori probability of voting. Commercial firms working for campaigns will often use past voting history as the measure of whether or not someone's going to vote. So from the voter file, you know, this is a person that's voted in the last 3 or 4 elections. But that's static and doesn't allow any movement up or down in turnout. Our method of asking and putting some faith in the voter in their responses is the key thing. You can check that too, though, and I tweeted this yesterday. Look at the makeup of our sample in each of the 5 regions of the state for that same last poll, the likely voter sample, and compare that with the actual percentage of votes that were cast in the Milwaukee City, the rest of the Milwaukee media market, the Madison media market. We're within 0.5% of the actual turnout using our methodology, including our likely voter methodology. So that's how we know that the makeup of the sample matches, with the caveat that the raw sample data always has these well-known biases. Civic participation is another well-known bias. So that's how we do that.
Hi, Charles. Can you take us through the time frame for your next poll? When you start it, are you going to change anything? And how do you capture Gen Z, which obviously, you know, it seemed to have a really big impact on this election?
Well, in one sense, the next poll starts today. We're doing a national survey that'll be out the week after Thanksgiving. But that's not a Wisconsin survey. I think the issue of young people's response rate is problematic, and the likelihood of turning out among young folks is a problem. We have almost always gotten, well, let me just say it straight up. The percentage of registered voters who are under 30, according to the Elections Commission, the voter file, is about 15%. We have typically got between 8 and 10% in that age group who respond. That's the raw response. So it's about half of the size, half or a little better than half of the size of the group. However, that fell off some this fall, and especially in the last survey where we had 1/3 of the size we were shooting for. Now, it could be that that reflects a lower participation rate in the election among those younger voters. But I think it's a good part of this is the obvious problem of reaching people on the telephone, and especially in that age group. Other pollsters are experimenting with things like text-to-web surveys, so you send a text message inviting you to click on a link and be reached that way. And just in talking to other pollsters, they're pretty optimistic about that. We did a full-blown test of that in July of 2020 when we did a statewide text-to-web sample at the same time we did our statewide telephone poll. We did that as a research and development project, not something that we intended to release. And I have to say, I was disappointed with the results of that. It didn't look comparable to the telephone survey, and it left me having real doubts about whether moving to that was a good option. But I've talked to enough pollsters in campaigns and in the media that I'm certainly thinking about it in the future, but I'm not prepared to jump on it just because it's a fad, because other people are doing it. I want to see the actual evidence that it really matters. A side point is, at this point, we don't know what turnout was by age group because the voter file certainly has not been updated. That'll be our best evidence of what turnout among the young was. We also won't know until the voter file is updated how many younger people registered on election day. So I'm seeing and reading a lot of stories about youth turnout. And there are claims that it was massive, and there are counterclaims that it was not so massive at all. New York Times had a good story on this week, presenting both sides of that evidence. So I'm happy to see what it is when we know it, but I think there's a little agenda driving what the various reports are. Plus, it can vary from place to place as well.
Charles, you asked this classic polling question. Do you think the state is going in the right direction or is off on the wrong track? Which a lot of people in politics and polling have viewed over time as like a great election barometer, where if the executive, the incumbent governor, if 48% are saying right track, he's going to get 48% of the vote or something like that. But in this case, 4 years ago, Scott Walker, a majority of voters thought the state was going in the right direction, and he loses. And this time you get the worst numbers ever, the highest wrong track ever you've ever recorded, and Tony Evers, the incumbent governor, wins. So what's going on there?
Well, tongue-in-cheek, I have to say, wrong track, wrong question. I sort of believe that. Just cards on the table. I've never been a huge fan of that question, but there are plenty of people that are huge fans. And I do think it's a plausible measure of how we feel about how things are going in the country these days. Gallup asks a question that's phrased sort of the way I just phrased it, how are things going, rather than right direction, wrong track. Certainly the way it's thought about is this is an indictment of the incumbents, whoever the incumbents are, because nobody wants your incumbent to be leading you down the wrong track, right? But I think we've seen this time especially the obvious evidence that the answer to that question is a very poor predictor of vote choice. In my post-election modeling, I find that right direction, wrong track is not statistically significant as a predictor of vote choice once you've controlled for ideology, party, and other things. And it's also closely tied to party. But I think there is a side issue, and that is that people from both parties can answer wrong track and mean very different things about why we're off on the wrong track. So the idea that a wrong track is necessarily an anti-incumbent answer, I think is less clear than it might have been a decade or 2 decades ago, in that people can be concerned about the direction of the country in ways that drive them to support Republicans, but they can be concerned about the direction of the country in ways that drive them to support Democrats. And you have to dig much deeper down to find out, why do you think we're off on the wrong track? Where did we take the wrong turn that's led to this? And so I intend to continue asking the question, because I think the trend of that over time does say something about how we feel about the state. But to simply translate that into a surefire reason why incumbents are going to lose, I think was kind of proven not to be the case this time.
Charles, in the beginning of October, Michels was polling at 46, Evers 47, and if we look at the Michels campaign, on October 18th, he said he would never, quote, arrest a doctor when talking about the total ban on abortions. The latest poll, Michels-Evers tied at 48. Are polls utilized in campaign strategies? Is that one way that they gauge voter interest and strategy again?
Yes, absolutely they are. And I say that, though, as someone who has never worked on a campaign and never had much desire to work on a campaign. But I hear tell that they use polls and pay some attention to them. Part of the point here is that campaign polls, again, with the caveat of I'm not working on it, are really, among other things, focused on message development, message testing. What should I say that plays well? How should I put an issue in order to gain voter support? Or what should I try to stay away from because it's such a hot issue it'll hurt me? I think that's a purpose very different from what public polling is about. I try very hard to ask about issues that are in the public domain that the candidates are talking about, or the legislature might be expected to act on, or are issues that the public is very concerned about in one way or another. But I will try very hard not to frame that question in terms of campaign revenue. Partly because I think that's the campaign's job, partly because I don't want to frame a candidate's point of view in a question. That's for the candidate to do, not for me to do. So I will ask, do you think abortion should be legal in cases of rape or incest, or should it not be legal? I don't say the Democrat says they should be legal and the Republican says they shouldn't. That's not my job. But a campaign poll might very well put those words or different words in their candidate's mouth in the survey to test what the effect of that is. So it's a delicate difference between what a campaign is using a poll for and what we're using a poll for. And the standard point here is that if we don't do public polling, then the campaigns will know the answers to all those questions, but the public won't. Because the campaign won't tell you folks. I mean, I know that the campaigns tell you everything, sincerely and honestly, and without any artifice every time. But public polling, for its flaws, and again, I'm not denying the flaws that we obviously have, is the one source that lets the public see what their fellow citizens are thinking without the filter of the campaign's self-interest in doing that.
Voter turnout was lower across Milwaukee County, except I believe Fox Point. How do you attribute population decline, restrictions on absentee voting, no drop boxes to this?
Some of these things I don't know the answer to is the easy answer. So absentee voting, drop boxes, those kinds of things, I don't have direct data on that, so I really can't answer it. On the population issue, there does seem to be some decline in Milwaukee County generally and in the city, but for the county and the city combined, where I do have data, my best read of census data, including the population estimates that are done between censuses, is that the county's population is down maybe 4,000 people. Not 4,000 voting age people, 4,000 people. But the turnout dropped 40,000. So I think it's quite a stretch to blame all of that on population change. Go ahead. You look like you have a follow-up.
Well, I was just wondering, what will this mean for the influence of the Milwaukee metro region for future statewide races?
Sure. I think turnout in the biggest metro in the state and the biggest county in the state is a huge issue for influence in politics. I don't think that influence is going to go away. But right now, Milwaukee County and city combined are punching below their weight relative to Madison, or Dane County, the fastest growing county in the state and increasingly the most Democratic partisan balance. Now, the city and county made up for that in some ways this time because the margin between Democrat and Republican went up even as turnout went down. So it didn't suddenly vanish as a big influence in the outcome of the elections. But I think the question, again, it's not my job to do this, but for the parties and the candidates to think about, is how are they organizing, how are they motivating voters, how are they responding to the needs of people in the city and the county, other than showing up in October and say, hey, remember me, vote for me. I think this is a long-term problem, and I think this is totally bipartisan, that we see attention to the needs and concerns in the city and the county peaking in the fall of election years, and with some question about just how present that concern is between. And just as a citizen, I would hope that that concern would expand between elections. And I just point out that it might pay electoral benefits if you also tried to serve the needs of the city and county.
So Charles,
That's a wild thought, just for your speculation.
So Charles, in the last two midterms, the final results have tracked very closely to the Marquette polling in 2018 and 2022, in both the race for governor and the race for Senate. In the last two presidentials,
Stop. That was very good. Just stop. Go ahead, Greg.
What I was going to say very politely was that in the last two presidential elections, they have not tracked quite as closely as they did in the midterms. And I know there's been no crystal consensus nationally about what's happened with the two Trump elections in terms of polling and why there seemed to be kind of an understatement of Republican support. But what is having now lived through these four cycles, what's your best guess?
Yeah, and let's not sugarcoat it. I was off by 7 points, almost 7 points in 2016. We cut that to about a 4-point error in 2020, so I'm pleased that we narrowed it, but it was still 4 points, though we got the winner right, which kind of counts for bonus points. But this is a big deal. Now, I thought 2018 was a huge sigh of relief for me, because in that interim from 16 to 18, when I answered at least 50 of those interviews about broken polling, it really was the question of, is polling as a methodology broken? And post-2016, there was no way to prove one way or another whether it was broken. So in 2018, we had the governor's race tied. Evers won by 1.1. We had Baldwin by 11. She won by 10.8. And I said, I should retire today. 2020, we had a 5-point race for Biden, and he won by just under 1. So again, we were off by about 4. Less than before, but still a bigger error than our normal. Over all of our polling, including those big errors, our average error is 2.2 percentage points on the margin of the race. So being off by 4.4 in 2020 was one of the better results in the state. The average error in the state was 8, so I want to claim some credit here. But again, it was still twice our long-term average. In 2016, we don't even want to talk about being 3 times worse than usual. But the why is the remaining question, and the best analysis is plausible but still inconclusive. It is that a certain type of voter, especially a Trump voter who may or may not be a Republican, is less willing to talk to pollsters than other Republicans. Not just other people, but other Republicans. And it's hard to know that because they won't pick up the phone. They won't talk to you, so you don't know much about the person that won't talk to you. That's a very plausible answer. Because in 16 and 20, we were quite close to the Democratic percentage, but we were systematically too low for Trump in both of those. And so it does look like a Trump issue. But is it the name Donald Trump, which takes us all the way back to that supposed shy Trump voter, which is easily discernible at every Trump rally because people just sort of sit there and hang themselves. They're very shy folks. So I'm not a fan of that theory, but it was, much talked about in 16. Now we're talking about failing to get people on the phone. I'll tell you that I don't know the answer to it, but a diagnostic we've been doing for the last 2 years, 2+ years, is with each survey, we look at the response rate by each of the 72 counties. So the percent of respondents out of all the numbers we dialed into that county. We then match that for each county against the Trump vote in 2020 and also third-party votes to look at alienation. And then we look for whether there's a correlation. Is it the case that the Trumpier places in the state have lower response rates? If that was the answer, we should see that pattern. I'm delighted to say that through the whole last 2 years, we have seen no correlation between response rate and support for Trump in 2020, or for that matter, third-party voting. It It could still be that there's some error out there, but the diagnostic that we're doing to track this exact thing has not flashed a red sign at all over the last dozen or so polls. So that's not a guarantee we won't have that problem at some point, but we do at least have a diagnostic to track it now. The last thing, then I'll move on, is there's also the possibility that we're looking at sort of things that are unique to individual elections, and that's something to do with Donald Trump being on the ballot. But it might be late shifts in vote. It could be just sort of the atmosphere of the campaign that he induces by being a candidate, rather than this idea that certain types of people don't talk to us. Again, there's some evidence for that. I characterized this the other day as that we have 3 or 4 strong suspects and a couple of indictments, but we don't have a conviction yet. So lots of things we think could be going on, but not yet something that's so clearly conclusive. Finally, if we knew what it was, we don't do it. We don't fix that thing. It's not as easy as that.
Charles, yesterday you were quoted in an article where you mentioned, and you say something like this: at some point, if no one will talk to you, you can't complete the survey, and that's the fear. So in today's political climate, is it harder to find people to trust you to open up and say what party they're for?
So 2 things. One is it's so damn hard to get people to pick up their phone. In 1988, I did my first national telephone survey that I was part of. It wasn't just mine, but I was part of it. National survey, 50 states, we had a 75% response rate on the phone. Our last survey here, 1.5% response rate. And so that's the order of magnitude of how much things have changed over this 40-year period. Remarkably, over these last 4 decades, as response rates have gone down, down, down because of first telemarketing calls, and then scam calls, and then caller ID that made it easier not to pick up. The accuracy of polls, 16 and 20 notwithstanding, has not gone down. In fact, it's gone up a little bit, again, with the exception of 16 and 20. And so response rate alone doesn't seem to affect polling accuracy. The obvious reason is that Democrats and Republicans alike hate scam calls and hate to have their dinner interrupted by me calling. And so there's not an inherent partisan bias, even as we're down to 1.5% that pick up their phones. Now, once they're on the line, the first thing we say is, I'm calling on behalf of Marquette University, so we fully disclose who we are when we call. A campaign pollster won't do that. The campaign pollster will say, I'm calling on behalf of Acme Polling, which nobody has ever heard of, but it's a true thing. But they don't identify themselves as calling from the Evers campaign or the Michels campaign for obvious reasons, right? So there is that point that I worry about. You hear that it's Marquette calling, and there could be a partisan bias in whether at that point people choose to respond. But the quote you mentioned is just the fear that as long as there's not a partisan bias in not responding, we solve that problem, and every pollster solves that problem by just making tens of thousands of more calls than we normally do. In the early October poll, we made 158,000 calls. In this last survey, the last one, 176,000 calls. I think the fact that people were being saturated by the election is one of the reasons that we had to make more calls. So that drives up costs, it drives up time, but it's still feasible. The fear, though, is that literally that number could go down more, and you reach a point where it's simply no longer an effective way of reaching people. That's one of the reasons that our national poll is now done online, with a sample that's sampled randomly from every address in the country that the post office delivers mail. So the company that we contract with samples that mailing address, sends a letter introducing who we are and what we're, I'm saying we, but it's the company that does this, that we contract with, and invites them to take surveys online over the coming months. That's an absolutely random sample of the population, so it has all the virtues that our telephone surveys do. But we're not interrupting people's dinner. They get sent an invitation to do a survey that can only be used by them. It has unique identifiers in it, and they can only answer the survey once, so it's none of the problems that non-random samples have. And I like it a lot. The trouble is it doesn't scale down to a state of our size. We don't have enough people who've agreed to do those online polls in the state yet. But if that number were to go up, if it reached a point of being feasible within the state, we would sure be looking at that either in whole or in part for 2024. Though I'm not convinced we'll be at that point. CNN did a poll using the methodology here in the state at the beginning of October, but they had to supplement it with telephone calls as well, and I think that's because of the lack of number of people who agree. So those are the ways that we're trying to solve this problem. We already talked about text to web as another way of trying to recruit people. I will say, this was the last thing. You mentioned whether people, I forget exactly how you put it, might be worried about saying what they say. We do some monitoring of calls for quality control and that sort of thing. I'm really struck how just straightforward most people are. There's some folks that are very angry and want to make points, and that's fine. We want their opinions as well. But the vast majority of respondents are somewhere between mildly engaged and actually pretty engaged and want to tell us what they think. And so I think this notion that some people systematically lie because they like to mess with pollsters, there may be a few people out there like that. You should just listen to these people and you honestly feel better about your fellow citizens, left or right, Democrat or Republican. These are mostly normal people, not completely obsessed with political agenda.
You mentioned
not that that's a bad
thing. You mentioned the red wave in your opening remarks. Where did this narrative come from? Was it born out of polling? Was it the media that brought this idea up, or was it just history that made this be talked about?
I think it's a mix of all these things. First of all, we do know that midterms are usually a bad time for the president's party. The average loss since World War II is 26 seats in the House and 2 seats in the Senate. And so you would be just perfectly justified on history terms to not only be confident of Republican control of the House, but a gain of some 26 seats, giving the Democrats about 196 and the Republicans about 239. That didn't happen. The majority is almost surely going to end up being there, but it's going to be a majority very close to the same size as Nancy Pelosi's majority, so not as much change. What I think was true is if you looked at the polling in every state with a gubernatorial or Senate race, which of course I did do, what you saw is that over the summer, Republican and Democratic splits were pretty static. In August, but especially in September and October, Democrats generally didn't plummet, but Republicans started moving steadily up. And I could tell myself a good story about why that was happening, because outside groups started putting money behind Senate candidates that had not campaigned very effectively, for example. There's also just the natural sense that as you get to Election Day, races tighten. Then there's the side question of what was the mix of the sources of polling during that period. And there's certainly a lot of concern that there was an abnormally large share of firms that are aligned with the Republican Party in one way or another, and that have typically produced results more favorable to Republicans in previous elections. Now, since most pollsters were off in a Democratic direction in 2020, those guys look pretty good in 2020, and so you couldn't dismiss them out of hand at all, because they were pretty good. But this time, as I said earlier, I think both that you had the mix of those folks coming in, but you also had this suspicion that, well, the polls were biased in a Democratic direction. Last time, they must also be biased this time, and so you tended to discount polls with real close races and give extra credence to the polls that were showing more of a Republican advantage or more of a rise in the Republican support. I don't have an answer to this. Saying a priori what the bias of a poll will be is perilous. I already mentioned that there's very little correlation between pollsters' errors last time and their errors this time. So I don't know what the solution to that problem is. The best advice I always have is track the same pollster over time, because then you're making a true apples-to-apples comparison. Our problem is that with the exploding costs of polls, because of the response rate we've been talking about, fewer and fewer media polls, media sources, university polls, are able to track the election. I mean, we did 4 polls from August to the election. But it used to be not uncommon for other pollsters to do 3 or 4 in a state. This year, it was uncommon for a pollster to do more than 1 in the state. So you only got the one bite of the apple and couldn't do that. I have no solution to that. Yeah. Give me more money. Yeah, no, that's not so good.
All right, I'd like to thank our panel for those questions, and now it's your turn. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. You can just stand and ask your question. All right, this gentleman first.
Your poll ended before, at least a little bit before a week before the actual election. We know from previous elections, oftentimes the party that's not winning does a lot of stuff to try and get their numbers up. So between the time that your polling ended, which is probably, what, Monday?
This time it was Tuesday, but normally it's Sunday night. We went 2 days longer this time.
Perhaps a lot of things happened that changed items around, maybe Obama, maybe Pelosi's situation,
sure,
maybe Biden, maybe Trump. How do you see that affecting your poll?
Right.
And maybe your polling was right, but these other items come in and
sure. I'm pretty happy with where we ended up. We had the Senate race as 2 points Johnson. He wins by 1. We had the governor's race tied, and Evers wins by 3.2 or 3.4. One of those is better than the other, but both of them are pretty good. It's always possible, though, that late things happen. 2016, the Comey letter is the prime example of a big event that happened after our last poll. And before the election. That's a risk that you take when you decide when to stop polling. And for the Marquette poll, we made a decision at the very beginning, back in before January of 2012, that our policy is to release the poll on the Wednesday before the election, on the grounds that that's early enough to still inform the public, but it deliberately sets aside the time from the day we release until Election Day to let the campaigns say what they want to say. In Iowa, for example, the Des Moines Register poll usually comes out the Sunday before the election, 2 days before. And that poll has a fantastic record of accuracy, so hats off to them. But I don't want us to be in that position of setting the agenda for the last 2 days of debate in the campaign. Now, I've had people, even people in campaigns, tell me they wish I would not release that early and push it up closer to Election Day. I don't quite follow their logic, but whatever it is. So anyway, the point is, you're right. We always run the risk that intervening events could occur. But I think as a matter of good citizenship, we don't want to be the last headline before the election. For better or for worse, there I stand.
Wait.
Quick question. You work for a religious school. I used to be a professor in the sociology department there. What was the role of religion in this election as you see it?
Sure. Well, in the simple demographic characteristics, we see the same kind of pattern we've seen for a good while now, that people who consider themselves evangelical or born-again Protestants are easily the most Republican of the religious groups. And here in the state, they make up about 18 or 19% of the state. Catholics make up about 28 or 29% of the state, but are more evenly balanced than I think some images might have. They're close to an even balance, but they'll tilt a bit Republican in one election, maybe a little bit Democratic in another, but they're not strongly partisan one way or another. So-called mainline Protestants, who are Protestant but not born again, are a little more Democratic-leaning than Catholics are, but it's the religious nuns, those people that say they have no religion or don't think of themselves as attached to any religious faith tradition. Those are the folks, and they're up to 20-ish% of the state now. Those are very Democratic-leaning groups, but they also tend to be very young groups, relatively speaking. So part of what we're seeing is a generational transition. I know if you go to my church on Sunday morning and look around, you see a lot more people with my hair color and not my daughter's hair color, right? So we're seeing not just a religious transition, but a generational transition. And how do you tease those two things out is an open question. But you can certainly see the growth of the nuns over the last decade of Marquette.
Gentleman here.
Race always plays an issue in our society, and in the Johnson campaign went negative. There were undertones of race as being a major issue. Do you get some polling on that to try to figure out the prejudice bias? How much? Because it's really strange that Barnes and Evers could win together as governor and lieutenant governor, and then break in this way. And just wonder where race and bias.
Absolutely. And this is irrelevant also back to the question of who's represented, what's the diversity in the poll. Black citizens make up about 4% or 5% of registered voters in the state. Hispanic citizens make up about 4%. And then likely voters, those numbers tend to be stable or go down slightly. So what that means is that in a sample of 800 people, and a group that composes 4 or 5%, we have just the tiniest number of people. It's the right percentage of Black and Hispanic and other, which is an even smaller category, but we almost, I won't say almost, we never have enough people in these small groups to allow independent analysis, poll by poll. So what we try to do is combine multiple polls over the course of the year to drive those sample sizes up over 100 people, which is still kind of small, but at least at that point we're beginning to get a little bit of a grip on it. And if you do that and look at these two races, we used feeling towards Black Lives Matter as an indicator of racial attitudes. It's not perfect, but it's simple. It's a group that matters, and you could also make the argument that it was implicit in some of the advertising as well. What we found from that is that in both the governor's race and the Senate race, there was a statistically significant effect of that attitude on vote in either of those two races. And again, this is after you're controlling for partisanship, favorability to the candidates, right direction, wrong track, personal finances. So there's a bunch, and feelings towards Biden and towards Trump. So with all of those things controlled for, attitude towards Black Lives Matter mattered in both races. But its effect in the Senate race was about twice as large as its effect in the governor's race. Now, I read you those results on abortion, and I said, these things matter, but don't think that they turn things night and day. They shift the probabilities a bit, the chance that you vote for one candidate or another. But I think we have good evidence now that race did play a role, or racial attitudes, let's call it that, played a role, and that it was greater in the Senate race than it was in the governor's race. But it was far from the only thing that mattered along with everything else.
Okay, we have another question over here.
So, excluding the Marquette poll, do you have an opinion on the best constructed and most accurate polls nationwide?
Yeah.
Or put Marquette in if you want.
No. No, I mean, that obviously is the right answer. No, I think, especially with this year's results, the Siena College poll, Siena did state polls here for Spectrum News, and also still has their affiliation with the New York Times, and they had a good batting average this year around the country. CNN, which didn't do very much state polling, but their poll here was pretty good. That was the one that was mixed, using the telephone, a little telephone and a lot of online. Marist College had a pretty good year. A lot of their results were good. So what am I mentioning? I'm mentioning stalwart polling organizations that, in this case, happen to be associated with universities. I don't think we got a lot of state-level polling from older standbys like NBC News or the Wall Street Journal. CBS did online polling around the country, and I'm trying to remember what individual state polls they did, though I think they did have one here that, if I'm right, had the governor's race tied 50-50.
Fox.
Oh, Fox News, sorry, thank you. Fox is really an excellent polling organization. Again, I'm not quite sure what their batting average is this year, but I think it was pretty good. They were close to ours a little. I think they had maybe Michels up 1 and Johnson up 3 instead of 2 and tied. But anyway, very close. Fox is one of those rare places that polled multiple times over the year here. And to me, it's really nice that they also showed Barnes ahead right after the primary. They also showed movement towards Johnson in late September, when our early October poll showed Johnson pulling ahead. And then they, too, pulled back a little bit at the end. So nice congruence there in these things. It's much harder to judge. Pollsters on the left, like Data for Progress, does a huge number of polls with a intent to influence progressive legislation. And pollsters on the right that have a similar agenda and similar service to the parties. I don't know what their Fox score is.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
I wonder if your polling gives you any insight into what is driving the density divide. What issues are turning rural Wisconsin redder and redder?
I don't have a great answer to that. One of my future projects is to try to devote a little more resources to rural Wisconsin, located literally here in the Marquette interchange. It's obvious why we pay most attention to the southeast, but I think the rest of the state matters a lot too. I think part of this is a matter of where do the voters live? And each party is paying a lot of attention to where their base lives. And so, if you're a Democrat, you'd be insane not to be paying attention to the concerns of Dane County and Milwaukee County, and a little attention to La Crosse and Eau Claire. If you're a Republican, you ought to be paying attention to some suburbs, but you especially have to look at the north and west of the state, where the movement has been so sharply Republican. So is it a matter of how the parties and candidates are focusing their efforts in denser places and less dense places? It's inconceivable to me that sheer density is the thing that drives this. But it could be the kinds of people that choose to live in cities rather than choose to live in the countryside. They have different values, different preferences. But I have to believe a good part of it is also, what are the parties saying to the public and who are they trying to appeal to? And those appeals have increasingly over the last few years had an urban-rural or density divide to them. But proving that is a little harder.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you again. Thanks again to our event sponsors and to the Newsroom Pub and the Safe House for being the hosting sponsor for this event. If any of you are interested in becoming members of the Milwaukee Press Club, Joette Richards is here, our administrator, and she'll help you out. Otherwise, go to MilwaukeePressClub.org. Some upcoming events I'd like to tell you about. There's a free event, free, on November 29th. Area journalists are discussing safety and sensitivity in crime coverage. This would be a great program for especially younger reporters, students, so anybody in your news organizations, send them this way. Again, it's free. So there's be more information on our website. I believe it's going to begin at 6 o'clock. 5:30, thank you.
So how late?
Tuesday, December 13th, County Executive David Crowley will be here, and Thursday, January 26th, again, big date, City of Milwaukee's 177th birthday party at the Grain Exchange. So mark those down, and I hope to see you there. And thank you all for being here for this great event, and have a good afternoon. Be safe out there.